Okay, so the growing interest in judgment-focused assessment in health professions education, particularly in workplace assessment, has seen an increased use in argument-based validity frameworks. And one such approach is the two-step process that's promoted by Kane. And so as Kane states, the argument-based approach is basically quite simple. First, state the claims that are made in a proposed interpretation or use, and this is the interpretation use argument, or the IUA. And second, evaluate those claims, and that's the validity argument. And this presentation will provide our interpretation of Kane's approach through illustrating how we've structured an IUA for the performance-based assessment tool that I presented earlier. So the IUA outlines a coherent sequence of claims that takes you from A to B. So in our case, that's from observed performances of students while they're on placement to making a decision about advancement towards or their readiness for professional practice. So our IUA starts out with the placement setting and claims that the setting affords opportunities for the student to undertake EP work roles for over a prolonged period. And therefore, a placement educator can make multiple and regular observations of the student undertaking these roles. From these observations, the placement educator makes a judgment about performance and uses the assessment tool to accurately represent this along the visual analog scale. And this judgment reflects the student's performance across the whole observation period. And from this judgment, we can infer competence. And next, this judgment predicts competence in a broader real life setting, and therefore the judgment can be used to make a decision about a student's readiness for entry-level practice. So in addition to the claims, the IUA also outlines the assumptions that are inherent in these claims, and it is the assumptions that then get tested in the validity argument. So on this and the following slides, I'm just going to give one example of the assumptions at each inference level, and also an example of the evidence that we have collected or are thinking about collecting to evaluate whether the assumption is reasonable to make. So an assumption of the context inference is that the students actually provided the opportunity to perform the work roles of an EP during their placement. So perhaps evidence to support this might come from student activity diaries or logbooks which record the depth and diversity of their experiences. Whoops. At the scoring inference, one of the assumptions is that the assessment tool accurately captures the placement educator's judgment about a student's performance and the theoretical and empirical evidence that we've been collecting as part of our assessment tool design would contribute to the argument for this claim. An assumption at the generalisation inference is that the placement educator has many opportunities available to make observations that can then inform their judgment. And so an example of evidence might be, it might include placement educator feedback on how they constructed their judgment, which would indicate that they drew on multiple and detailed observations across the placement. One of the assumptions of the explanation inference is that those elements being assessed reflect the attributes required for safe and effective practice as an EP. And so the assessment supporting this would include one of the studies that we've already completed, which explored how EPs conceptualised competent performance, which then led to the co-construction of a set of integrated competencies that were then embedded in the assessment tool. An assumption of the extrapolation inference is that performance is assessed through observations of students who are immersed in a context that's equivalent to a real life setting. And perhaps the evidence that would support this is an argument for the similarity between the placement settings and the real life workplaces of EPs. And then finally, one of the assumptions at the utilisation inference is that the pass standard on the assessment tool reflects entry-level practice. And so perhaps some evidence for this might include interviews with recent graduates who are now working as EPs to explore their views on readiness for practice. So I thought I'd finish off with some of the lessons that we've learnt so far using Kane's approach. First, it's not so simple. Developing a coherent and complete IUA and validity argument requires a lot of work and it's quite iterative. Second, never underestimate the importance of the IUA. Without this first step, you have no framework to build your validity argument. Third, the chain of inferences in the IUA must be situated in how the assessment data will be interpreted and used. And this might mean that different inferences might be required to the traditional four that we often read about, which are scoring, generalisation, extrapolation, and utilisation. And then finally, it's best to consider the validity argument as a work in progress. It keeps evolving as new assumptions come to light, and it's potentially something that's endless.